She might have said something about it, but I think my research collaborators was coming. They're coming.
To everyone watching via the webinar, if you'll give us a couple of moments, we're still having people arrive for the in-person portion of the event. And so hang with us a few minutes and we will get started here in 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you.
All right, it's a pleasure to see you here again in the continuing saga of Amazonian-related questions about Brazil, but in Amazonia writ large, not only Brazil. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Simon Lobach. He's a PhD with me in the Graduate Institute in Switzerland. He's part of the globally extensive Amazon Lab, which includes people from a number of institutions in the United States and also in Europe. And he's on his way to speak, has been speaking at various aluminum conferences. It's a circuit I don't know much about, but apparently it's a thing. And then he's off to the Latin American Studies Association meeting in Vancouver. So we've plucked him from the sky. And he was kind enough to agree to speak to us today and also to give us some insight about this extremely important dynamic of mining in Amazonia, not just because of the the aluminum ore, but also because of the energy infrastructure that goes with it. Aluminum, of course, is going to be central in the so-called energy transition that everybody is yearning for. But as I always say, everything comes from somewhere. So in this sense, as you're not kicking the tires, but slamming the doors, perhaps on that new EV, you might be thinking about actually where the aluminum might come from. Simon has an interesting career. He's not a person who slogged through various points in his training in a kind of sequential way. His training is in history, in Latin American studies, and international affairs. So he comes at this with quite a broad scope in terms of his thinking. He's been a consultant for the UN on various forms of environmental policy, and he has an extensive fieldwork portfolio that has included Cuba, Guyana, Suriname, and Venezuela. And he also has been a visiting scholar at the Núcleo dos Altos Estudos Amazônicos in Belém, Brazil. It's important to realize that he's one of the few people who can do archival work on Suriname because he's Dutch. I haven't noticed that there are all that many Dutch-speaking people who can use these archives, so it's extremely important as well. So without further delay, let's go to the presentation and of Simon's on aluminum in Amazonia. And I think we'll find this all quite illuminating, so to speak. All right, bye-bye. And I turn the thing over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for this introduction. I'm very happy to be here. As Susanna already said, I was in Quebec last week on an aluminium-related conference. So I was speaking to the industry people where someone actually afterwards came to me and said like, oh, they had a social scientist on the program. No way. Like it is interesting to look to be able to look to a specific industry from a social scientist perspective, at the same time also being, of course, among social scientists, bringing this kind of industrial perspective and especially related to Amazonia. I called this talk Aluminum in Amazonia, Unmodern Encounters. Well, about the unmodern part, I will make this argument over the course of the presentation. I have to say something about the first word of the presentation, which is one of the few words in the English language that has two different ways of saying it. In the US, the word is aluminum. In the rest of the world, it's basically aluminium. So I tried to adapt it in my presentation, but forgive me if I have a few aluminiums slipped in, and I will say aluminium because I constantly forget to say aluminum. So how do I go to the next slide? Oh, I'm in the Zoom now, right? I'm not in there. Yeah. Okay. So I will just, there are three parts to my presentation. One is something about aluminium in general and about the invention of it. Secondly, Amazonia, a mythical space, but for whom? And thirdly, of course, bringing the two together, aluminum in Amazonia. So it's a very simple, basic outline. So something that is interesting to know about aluminium is that it is not really an old material in the sense that it has been invented fairly recently at the end of the 19th century. What we see here, by the way, is the aluminium bar, the way it used to be produced. Today it's called an ingot, it's much bigger, and the alumina, which is the outgrade product. And this is, of course, how it has come to be used in modern times. So it is in a way a symbol of modernity, but it has become that over a relatively short span of time. Aluminium makes up 8.23% of the Earth's crust, so it is really abundant metal, but still it was very difficult to get to it for a long time because of the link of aluminium with oxides, and you have to break that link, and that is a process that requires a lot of energy. So there have been cases of aluminium being applied by several people. Even since antiquity, there are a few examples of aluminium being extracted from the aluminium ore, but there were very few, and it made the aluminium a very expensive material as well, because you had to provide all this energy and this very elaborate process to get to the aluminium. So this, for example, is an example of early use of aluminium in a plate for someone. And you have to imagine that in the time that this was made, this was more expensive than gold, right? So this is actually a more exquisite item than if it were made of gold. And that really changed when these two people came about. So one is Paul Héroult, and the other one is Charles Hall. And they were two inventors who, at the same time in history, invented a new process to extract aluminium from aluminium ore. One is French, the other one is American. And the fact that they invented the same process at the same time led to also the industry existing in two places at the same time. And it also led to the fact that we have two words for the metal today, right? So what is this process exactly to come to produce aluminium? It all starts with bauxite, which is the raw material, a reddish rock that is relatively abundant, especially in the tropics, and especially in places with a lot of rain. I guess you can see the connection already. There's two processes that you have to do in order to come to aluminium from bauxite. The first is called the Bayer process. It's basically a chemical process by which you treat the bauxite with other substances, including caustic soda, to clean it from all the other elements that are present in the rock, right? So you end up with only the alumina, which is Al2O3, so this aluminium oxide, and there is a lot of other materials that are produced. So these other materials you have to deposit somewhere. They come from the soil, but they are now also polluted with caustic soda. So when you put them back, you're not putting back the same thing that you started with, you're putting back something toxic. So then you have the alumina, L2O3, And then the next process is the Hall-Héroult process, called that way for obvious reasons, which is the immersion of the alumina in a bath of cryolite, which is another aluminium-containing substance. You don't need to know all of that, of course, but the crux is that you have to combine it with an anode, which is in a large carbon object that you put into the same basin as well. And then you put the entire thing under a electric current. And this requires a lot of electricity. And in the old days, before we had the same kind of batteries that we have today, it had to be hydroelectricity, because it was basically the only source of electricity that could be as constant enough, reliable enough, and also large enough to actually do this process. So that is why aluminium has a double raw material that is required. One is bauxite, the other one hydroelectricity. And hydroelectricity is actually as important for the recipe as bauxite is. So you cannot really talk about aluminium as being mined only. You always have to think, but where does the energy come from? Because that is often the bottleneck, not the bauxite, but the energy. And also, as you can see, what is the chemical process? It is the O in here that is going to react with the C in here. So these anodes, I've been able to see them in Quebec when I was visiting one of these plants. It's just a major block of carbon, basically, inside, that goes into that bathroom. So the C is going to react with the O, and it leaves the L, the aluminium. So what happens when you combine C with O? You get CO2, right? So there's a lot of CO2 emissions from the aluminium industry. And that is not only because of the energy requirements, but also because of the chemistry of the process. So you have a double source of CO2 in aluminium, right? Let that sink in, because it's a lot of information, I guess. This is just a graph that shows us how many metals we have been mining in a regular year, like 2021. Oh, it's 2019 actually. And you can see iron is the major metal, but aluminium is second, right? It's the second largest metal that we've been mining. So it is really an important metal. Like gold is here somewhere. This is gold. So by comparison, you can see like it's really an important industry. But why is it so impactful? Is because if you look at the energy requirements of aluminium, you'll see that if you compare it to, for example, steel, it is like 10 times more, right? So you have a very large amount of aluminium, not as much as iron or steel, but it requires much more energy. So the impact is also much larger. If you look at all the metals here, you see aluminium is actually the second largest energy input of all, only second to titanium, but of course titanium we use much less of. This is a graph showing the development of the global aluminium production over the past few decades. And you see it has been fairly constant for a while, and it is no longer very constant. It has gone up since the 1990s, it has gone up quite steeply. And there is one region of the world that is mainly responsible, which is not even a region, it's a country, it's China. So China has basically taken over the aluminium sector, and they didn't used to produce aluminium. They have bauxite, but not that much. They get a lot of bauxite from other countries. The bauxite is not even very good, but they have invested a lot in their electricity capacity. That's how they've been able to do this. That's basically the only change. You see Latin America is fairly constant, the other regions as well. This is Russia, but it was there before as well. This is the Soviet Union. It says unreported, but the Soviet Union did not report to the agency that gathered all this information. So it's basically the same smelters, the same plants. So China is the big change, as well as the Gulf countries. And the Gulf also there's not a place that's very well known for their hydroelectric capacity, of course. So that leads us to a comparison among countries about which countries have the cleanest, if you could say that, aluminium. And you see that places like China and the Emirates, Qatar, are among the worst, like in terms of how much they emit in order to get their aluminium. And if you look at this side, Norway, Iceland, but also Guyana, Suriname, Brazil, Venezuela are the greener types of aluminium. And that is a notion that I accept, but at the same time, I want to question it as well, because how green is this hydroelectric energy generation in the end? So this is what the aluminum industry would like us to look at, especially the companies that are active in the Amazon. They say, look, this is the energy source of the energy of aluminium over time. And as you can see, in the 80s, it was mainly hydroelectric energy, the blue part. There were some people being funny. They were making aluminium out of fossil fuels. The Japanese, for example, that's why the Japanese shifted a lot of their aluminium production to Brazil, actually, at some point. But since the 1990s, this has gone really crazy. You see, there's a lot of fossil fuel-based aluminium being produced today. So that actually makes the Brazilian aluminium industry still stand out as a relatively green industry in comparison to what other countries are doing. And again, it's mainly China, but also Russia to some extent. Now, if we look at climate change policies, these are the metals that we are really needing in the coming decades if we want to keep the climate change below 1.5 degrees. So there's lithium, cobalt, etc., and also aluminium again. And as you can see, aluminium is a metal that is at the same time required for the energy transition. So we make windmills out of them. Electric cars are made out of aluminium, but also needs to be lowered. So at the same time, we need to increase, but also for other uses, like airplanes maybe, we need to actually lower our aluminium production. So it has to not only increase, but also be directed into other sectors. Now I come back to Amazonia, and this is the map that I've been working with over the past few years, showing where aluminium exists in Amazonia, where it is being produced. So if we go over the entire sector, we see the orange dots are places where bauxite is being mined. But bauxite is present at much more locations, right? It is a very abundant material. These are only the places where it is mined, basically because it's the best bauxite, or because it was convenient to mine it at these locations. But there are many other places where it could be mined. I don't say it should, but it could. This is Paragominas. This is Original and you see in Suriname, the former Dutch colony and the northern part of Amazonia, Guyana, and Venezuela. Los Viraguas. Then, if you look at the other ingredient for aluminium production, which is the hydroelectricity, as I said, here's this Tucuruí, a large dam that was built in the 1980s, and Belo Monte, the new dam that was built recently, like 10 years ago. And these are the power lines that connect them. And the gray dots are the plants. So there is one plant in Belém, Pará, in Barcarena, and there's one in São Luís do Maranhão. So there's two Brazilian plants in Amazonia. In Suriname, you get the entire complex. It is all owned by Alcoa, Aluminum Company of America. However, in Suriname, they have since closed. So it is all belonging to the past, except for the dam. Of course, the dam is still generating electricity. Guyana is the only country that has never developed its own aluminium industry. They continue exporting bauxite. They had for a while an alumina factory, so they did the process halfway, but they have stopped doing that. But they have dreamed of having a dam for generations, basically. They just never got to the point of actually being able to build it, but they have tried forever. And Venezuela has here the mine, and here's 4 dams in a row: Caraguachi, Guri, I can't always remember all the names, and a plant as well. So they have their own aluminium as well. So this is the map I've been working with in the sense that I've been trying to visit all of these locations over the past, like since the pandemic, basically, which was quite a challenge. So I spent hundreds of hours on boats, buses, cars, occasionally on a flight. But these locations are, of course, all very remote, especially well, except for the smelters, right? Except for the plants, it is difficult to get to these dams and mining areas. So now Amazonia, whose mythical space, I invented this title like 2 days ago or something, but the idea of Amazonia as a mythical space, of course, it comes even from the name, like the Amazon, like the Amazonians, the Greek myth. When Columbus got to the Amazon, he saw these wetlands at the estuary of the Orinoco River, and that's why he called it a name that was reminiscent of Venice, right? So Venezuela is derived from the word Venice. But there is another myth of Amazonia that I would like to talk about, and I think that Susanna may have also done it already. Of course, you have seen this many times. Sometimes people believe that the Amazon is in Brazil, but it's rather the other way around. It is 9 different countries, right? So Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and often forgotten Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana. So this is the biome. It is not the river basin, right? The river basin is actually smaller. It is the biome. So this is in our area with similar ecological conditions. I guess you've seen this as well, deforestation coming mostly from this side, but also from the other sides, the other countries. But the main myth that I would like to talk about comes from this gentleman, Alexander von Humboldt. You have heard of him, of course, the Humboldt stream, etc. The father of ecology, one of the first people to actually invent such a science, if it were. And he wrote in French. What he wrote when he visited the Amazon for the first time in the end of the 18th century was, among other things, this richness of the soil, this force of organic life. It multiplies the means of subsistence and slows down the march of peoples towards civilization. So this is an idea that we often find, right? Like if you are in the Amazon or in any other tropical region for that matter, if it is both humid and warm, then the fruit will just fall from the tree. So why would you work, right? These people are just lazy. They just lie in the sun or under a tree and the fruit falls on their head and they don't need to do anything. And that's why they're not civilized. So this is an idea that we find very often. And even though we know that it's not true, because we have shown that it's not true, it still haunts us because it is a myth that is very, it's appealing to people because they think like, oh, we need to develop this space for something else so we can provide jobs to these people, so we can develop the space because it's so fertile. Everything grows, so why would you just leave a forest on such fertile ground rather than doing something more that could feed more people? And the myth, of course, comes from the fact of Humboldt being European and European ecosystems working very differently from Amazonian ecosystems in the sense that in Europe, when a tree dies or a material decays, the nutrients pass through the soil into another organism, right? So that means that the soil is a container of nutrients, whereas in Amazonia, the nutrients have a cycle above the soil because the soil is basically sand, meaning that anything that falls on the soil and is then leaked into the soil is lost to the ecosystem. I guess Susanna has already talked about this quite extensively.
Lecture 1.
So that is why all organisms are trying to eat each other before the nutrients can reach the soil. So that's why you get this exuberant nature and this force de vie organique. It is not because Amazonia is fertile, but rather the opposite. It's because it's infertile. And this is a classic mistake that Europeans make when they go to Amazonia. That is also why this doesn't work. If you deforest, and you can get some nutrients out of the soil for some time, but then you have to start applying fertilizer, and it doesn't give this fertility that you thought you would find when you saw the nature before you cut it down. So this is really the mindset of a European not understanding the ecosystem. And it also means that when you take people off their lands in Amazonia, they cannot just go somewhere else, because if you take them off the land, they needed all that space in order to be able to survive off the land. And if you take some part of it or you take all of it, they will not be able to migrate anywhere else. These are pictures that I took in Suriname. On the left side, you see someone preparing a piece of land for agriculture. As you can see, the trunks are still on the ground. So that is the way people do agriculture, but they leave it for only a number of years and they abandon it, they go somewhere else. And this looks like a forest, and it is a forest, but 2 years ago, this was still an agricultural plot. So that's how fast the forest can recover, as long as you do it like a small scale, and you respect certain conditions. And this is how not to respect these conditions. This is like the way other people do deforestation in Amazonia, or logging in this case, on the land of the same community that also is planting here. And there is another peculiarity about the communities that are affected by aluminium, because bauxite tends to occur at the margins of the Guyana Shield. So basically where the rock stops and the wetlands begin. And this area is also where in colonial times the plantations would stop. So it's basically where the sandy soil starts. So when Europeans came to Amazonia and started their colonies, they had sugar plantations, coffee plantations, etc., all at the border zones of the Guyana Shield. So where the sandy soils start, that is where they would stop, because the soil would not give them enough to do a plantation. So what happened was that many of these Africans that were shipped to the Caribbean, or to the Caribbean Amazon, to Amazonia, to work on these plantations, they would often escape into the forest. They would flee the plantations and set up communities in the forest. And oftentimes they would do it right at the margin of the plantations, so that it could still come back to free other people that were left behind, or to obtain certain food items or other items. And that is why, in the case of bauxite mining, there is a specific impact on Afro-Amazonian communities, because these are the people who are typically found on bauxite areas. So whereas hydroelectric development often impacts indigenous people, bauxite mining areas, as well as some of the aluminium plants, affect mostly Afro-Amazonian communities. So this picture I found interesting. It is a picture that was taken from the first expeditions, or not expedition, but the first development of a company town in Suriname, the first country that moved into the aluminium sector, when they started a company town for bauxite mining. And this is a Dutchman, like myself, who is picturing a woman with 2 children belonging to the Njuka community, Maroon community. So Maroons are these, right, African descended escapees. And what I try to do in this dissertation that I'm writing, that I'm finishing, is to turn this camera around and to make a selfie of the people who were doing this, because I think there is a lot of literature on these different communities, and that's very interesting, but I cannot do all of that because there are very many of them, right? There is in every place where the aluminium sector arrives, it's a different community, a different culture. I don't want to go into that and to describe how do these people plant and how do they live, etc. There are many studies on those, like those. But I would like to look, the community that I study, if I were an anthropologist, I would study the aluminium sector as a community. And it is also a community to which I myself, to some extent, belong, because this is a compatriot of mine, of course. So I like to look at the aluminium industry as a community that's active in Amazonia, and what kind of convictions they held, what kind of attitudes they had, and how did they justify this aluminium project. So now we move into this aluminium in Amazonia part of the presentation. And it starts with this man, John Risen Gibbons, who, as you can see, I put these 2 logos or flags or whatever together. John Risen Gibbons was a man who was born in Virginia. He was part of the Confederate uprising. He was actually a colonel in the Confederate Army. He was there at the moment that the Confederates surrendered. And after that, he became involved in the Aluminum Company of America. And he was the man who was sent to Suriname to look for, and to British Guyana to look for bauxite. So this is an interesting figure. Actually, I read through all his papers when I was in Pittsburgh just 3 days ago, that the origin of the Aluminum Company of America is already such a, well, there is an interlinkage between racism and aluminium in this sense. Even if you look at where they were located in the first place in Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh was a place that Pennsylvania was one of the first states that abolished slavery, actually. So many of the early workers in the Alcoa factories were people who were descended from Black Americans who fled from, for example, Virginia to Pennsylvania to look for freedom. So I think there is an interesting parallel there between Maroons in the Amazon and Maroons in Pennsylvania to a certain extent, even though Maroons in Pennsylvania it's an urban population, so I don't think you can call them Maroons easily. But let's go to a part of the papers that I wrote. Oh, you cannot read this, right? Shall I? Is there a way I can make this visible?
You could like drag the,
Can I?
yeah, I feel like
You can also close where it says participant is enabled closed captioning.
Oh yeah.
So get that X over on the right, you can just get rid of that. And if you want to drag the whole bar.
I don't think I can because I don't think I'm looking at this is in the.
or I think if you click on the green thing, you're screen sharing. Yeah.
And drag it down to the bottom.
Oh, okay. So this is what he wrote when he first went into this Maroon community of Rora in Suriname. And he wrote about meeting the leader of the Maroons. So we found here His Majesty, because he first had introduced that Maroons are like a separate nation or something within Suriname. So he sarcastically talks about the chief of this Maroon community as the Majesty, seated on a plank supported by 2 boulders of bauxite, wearing a shirt and a pair of pants of ancient vintage. His Majesty met us with great cordiality and welcomed us to his palace, which consists of 8 forked poles stuck in the ground with poles across to support a roof made of thatched palms. And then he goes on about the Amazonian environment, and then he said, when our party presented the gin, the whites of the Governor General's eyes, that is again the Majesty, became his most valiant feature, and he made us welcome to his entire realm, offering to make his people subservient to our wishes, which later we were pleased to have him do. So Gibbons is suggesting that the Maroons of Suriname sold the land for a few bottles of gin, which is not exactly how the community itself remembers it, because there is a story that the leader was asked to come to the capital with basically a diploma that he had. Like at some point, Suriname gave the lands to the Maroons. Like they said, okay, you can have those lands and just leave us alone for now, because they used to raid the plantations a lot. Like the Maroons would come back to the plantations, bring other people back, obtain other items. And at some point they said, okay, stop this, you get your land. And so there was a diploma or a certificate that the leader had. And at some point he was asked to come to the capital, and people said, oh, your diploma is too old, you have to renew it. And he got another piece of paper in return with a lot of stamps on it, but it was just a worthless piece of paper. And he had basically given away his land title. That is how the community remembers his story. But within the Alcoa archives, you find the story of the Maroons sold the land for a few bottles of gin. So now how do I continue? Oh. So that is what happened next. The bauxite mine was set up in Mungo in Suriname. And here you see an early painting of the bauxite mine. You see some tropes of tropical ecology. And of course, you see the Maroon figure in the foreground looking at basically lost in time, some kind of hunter-gatherer in front of this symbol of modernity. So this is a picture from the same place. Maroons who were living around the mining sites, they were allowed to come to Mungo, basically to sell their agricultural produce. Women were also engaged to wash clothes for the company workers and their families. But they were required to leave the town by 5 o'clock every day. So this story of providing jobs to the population already from the beginning is tricky, because it was not jobs for the population of the Amazon, but jobs for people who would be brought into the Amazon, not for the locals. And bauxite quickly became a very interesting, and aluminium, an interesting commodity, especially because of the conflicts of the first half of the 20th century. At some point, because of the Second World War, was so reliant on airplanes, and which were made of aluminium, that Suriname and British Guyana, which were the major source of bauxite at that time outside of Europe, of course, Europe was a bit of an issue to get bauxite from, that they were the ones that provided the aluminium to the American and Canadian war industry. And of course, the Germans also wanted a share of that, right? Suriname was the main exporter of bauxite worldwide. And this is a picture of an expedition in Brazil led by a German to look for bauxite in Brazil. And the idea was to also get a share of Amazonian bauxite, and eventually to even overtake Suriname and British Guyana. It never materialized, but that was the idea. Some of the people who are present in this expedition were later interviewed, and they were asked, "Do you have any idea what the symbol meant that was on the back of your boats?" And they said, no idea, just a bunch of Europeans looking for bauxite. And in the end, after the war was over, in Suriname, there was this feeling, oh, look at us, we're so important, because we were the ones who provided the bauxite for the Second World War to be fought. So that was the moment that they thought, maybe we should not only mine bauxite, we should actually produce aluminium here in Suriname. And that is when this idea came with of building the dam. Building the dam in order to be able to generate electricity to have an aluminium factory in Suriname. And that was also the first aluminium factory in Amazonia. That was in the 1960s. And of course, this flooded a lot of land, and this land, again, belonged to Maroon communities. So what about the population? So here we have a report on Bush Negro. It says the Bush Negro issue, Bosneger vraagstuk, written by Gerold Stahel, who was actually a Swiss citizen, but he was the director of the Agricultural Research Center in Suriname. And he had a plan to bring the population of the area that would be flooded by the dam to another area of the country where there was a lot of need for agricultural workers. So he said, well, if we do that, we bring just the Maroons from their place in the jungle and bring it to these plantations so they can have a job, and we can flood their land in the meantime, and so they can stop being bush Negroes and parasites in our country. That was the language that was used to justify this plan. And this gentleman, who was the first author of the National Development Plan of Suriname, he wrote, "A piece of wilderness will be taken away from them and their needless isolation will come to an end." So also for them, the Bracaponda project is therefore of great value. Bracaponda project being the dam being built. And what, of course, they did not really look at was the fact that these plantations that they were supposed to be brought to were the exact same plantations that they had fled 2 centuries earlier. Right? So basically bring them back to the place that they didn't want to be in order to be able to flood their lands. That would be beneficial for them. And this shows also that these two people were not Dutch citizens or colonials in that sense. They were actually people who were present in the colony, but were leading characters of institutions in the colony, and were actually the ones who were preparing also for Suriname's independence. So it was not like the Dutch were in Europe doing plans in Suriname. It was actually a Surinamese idea, because they thought maybe this way we can become more important and we can actually prepare the way for independence. And that's what they did. Now, if we move now to different places, because I've been dwelling a lot on Suriname because it was the first mover. In Brazil, a similar rationale was also followed in the 1970s and 80s to also develop an aluminium industry in Brazil. And of course, this was largely informed by this ideology of the dictatorship of conquering the Amazonian space for several reasons. It was through the distribution of lands, through the building of roads. Here you see a relief that is present in Boa Vista, the capital of Roraima, showing a heroic scene of conquest of indigenous populations, gold seeking. All these activities were meant to actually effectively occupy the territory for Brazil in order to stop this ambiguity of who does the Amazon really belong to. And this was the idea of like a land without men for men without land. And of course, this was based on this myth that the Amazon was empty. It was not a land without men, it was a land full of men and women. So that was the ideology that prepared the arrival of the aluminium industry in the Brazilian Amazon. This lady, Violeta Loureiro, is currently a professor in Belém. She has written a few interesting books on the Amazon. But in one of these books, she remembers something that happened 40 years ago when she was a young scholar, and she had the opportunity to ask a question about this project of bringing the aluminium industry to Brazil, to the Amazon. And she said, after the presentation of the project, I timidly asked its super powerful minister of the military dictatorship whether the project could cause any environmental damage to the communities and the nature around the projected site. So instead of answering my question objectively and didactically, he inquired about my age, and after hearing my reply, he answered, grow up, read about development, and ask me that again 20 years from now, when we will have developed. You have to understand that first we think of development, and afterwards we correct environmental problems. Of course, maybe this answer would have been different if this were not a female scholar, but a male scholar. There's several power dynamics at play here. But the interesting thing is that, well, she is now a renowned professor, and Mr. Delphine Netel is still alive. However, the story doesn't tell us whether she ever got back to him and then asked him that question again. And it is very questionable whether indeed this area of Brazil has, in the meantime, developed. Right? We can all agree that this is not an evident answer to that question. In any case, it has not developed with the people who were there 40 years ago. It was developed for other people. So if we want to look at these impacts that Professor Lehrer was talking about, the aluminium companies, they will say like, well, these are the impacts, the mining sites. That is what we need to talk about. And that's relatively small, right? Much smaller than, for example, the site affected by gold. But still, there is an impact, but basically they're just switching soil around, right? They're just getting the bauxite out, transport it to somewhere else, and then close it again. So they're fairly okay in comparison to gold mining, for example. But I would say there is much more that we need to take into account. Also, the sites of the factories, which, as I said, have these deposition of toxic materials next to it. This image is very contentious because communities in Barcarena, close to Belém, they say, look, what happens? It overflows when it rains too much. Whereas the company says, look what happens. We have a security system that contains it if it rains too much. So how to interpret this image is questionable, but there is certainly a major safety hazard if anything would happen to these basins. If it really overflows, you surely have a great problem. Of course, something else that we need to take into consideration when talking about the aluminium sector is also the infrastructure that is needed for aluminium to be produced in the Amazon. And here we see a bauxite vessel taking bauxite out of the mine in Western Pará. And this is a copy of it made by a Maroon gentleman, a gentleman belonging to the Maroon community of Oriximiná. He made a copy of this ship. This is a thing. I've seen many people doing this as a hobby. But he wrote Apocalypse on it. That is the name of his bauxite ship. Something else we need to take into account is, of course, where does electricity come from and the flooding of these lands. And aluminium companies would say, no, but that's a different company. We buy electricity. But what if these dams were built with the sole purpose of providing electricity for the aluminium plants? That was the case in the beginning. In Suriname, it was the case. It was the case with Tucuruí in Brazil, but it's no longer the case now. People say, no, we're just building the dam for electricity without specifying electricity for whom. But we still know, if we look at the numbers, who is using the electricity, many of these dams are built for aluminium. And then there is the issue of these factories being located on lands that belonged to other people before and having been sold by the military dictatorship without these people being informed. And this is from the website of Hydro, that is a Norwegian company that has since acquired the mines and aluminium factories in Pará. And it says illegal settlements are a widespread problem in Brazil. And illegal settlements have been established inside the Alunorte's industrial area. Alunorte is the alumina facility. These have been sold without proven ownership rights. And in these cases, the authorities have been informed and courts have the power to order the police to remove illegal occupants. This, of course, is without taking into consideration that these illegal occupants that we're talking about were the communities that were there before, right? So it was basically the military who sold off the land to the aluminium companies without telling them that there were people on the land. And of course, they could have known if they had just looked for that, right? And what is also funny is I used this slide in this presentation that I did last week in Quebec, where I had to change a lot of this. I did an entirely different presentation. I had to, but this slide was in there. And I received an email afterwards from the Hydro guy saying, but this is not us, this is the police. Police is taking care of it. Like, it's not us, we don't remove people, police does. This is a map made by a colleague in Belém at the Nuclear Geological Studies Amazonicos of the lands in Barcarena, part of Barcarena. You see a few of the communities, and you see also the places where they used to go to collect fruits or nuts, the place where they used to go to hunt, to fish, the sources of water, places with a cultural relevance. Here also, I can't find the symbol now. But what you can see is that these areas are the basins used by not only the aluminium industry, also kaolin, which is a related type of clay, also being produced often in association with aluminium. So these are the basins where all these polluting elements are deposited in. And the yellow areas are the areas belonging to the industries. And this area is not even home to anything, no industry, no basin, but this is an environmental compensation area that they had to have in order to be able to operate. So they set apart this piece of land for environmental compensation, put a fence around it, and then prevent people from going in there, even though it's their land, right? So it works in many different ways, not only through the basins themselves, which threaten these populations, but also through the environmental policies that are put in place to do environmental compensation.
Oh, sorry, I have a question. So the basins are like where the metals get separated, and so like, is there another process where there's like smelters? You said
the smelters are out here.
Okay, so there's two different stages for aluminum.
Yeah, so this is the aluminum production, and for that you have this caustic soda that you apply to the rock, and then anything that is in the box that is not aluminium is then separated.
Okay.
And then it is deposited somewhere.
Okay.
Along with that's what the basins are for. Yeah. And there's basically no way to get it away, because wherever you take it, if you take it out, where are you going to put it? It's the same problem again. So what they have done in other places of the world, like in France, it used to have an aluminium industry in the past, more than today. They used to just cover it with 2 meters of sand, and then you have a park on top or something. But you can never build houses there. You can never do agriculture because there's all this toxic stuff underneath. And that is an issue, of course, in Brazil. If you do the same thing, how do you know that people will not use it to build houses on or do agriculture? Not now, but also not 200 years from now or 500 years from now. So that is an issue. There is a huge afterlife that is very difficult to manage. In France even, right? How do we know what French people will do 500 years from now?
Is it like a tool with cement on the bottom?
They do now with some kind of plastic stuff to separate it, but they didn't use So these are a few pictures of my field work, me visiting communities that were displaced. These people were affected due to the risk of leakage from these basins. This is the area just next to the factory. This is the smelter. This is an indigenous community playing football on the beach. And this is a community that was displaced by a hydroelectric dam of Tucuruí. And looking at that, you can also see here is the Tucuruí Dam. But once you build a road to connect this dam, well, first you have to build a road in order to be able to build the dam. And once you have built the road to connect the dam to anything else, you have these power lines coming in, you have the road coming in. Then, of course, you also open up the area to other sectors, right? So this used to be all forest when the dam started. They started the dam building in the middle of the forest. And you see there's hardly any forest left in the entire area. So you shouldn't only look at the surface of the lake. You should look at the entire area that was forested as a result. Of course, maybe not aluminium is not the only one to blame, but it is definitely a factor, because without aluminium there would be no dam. The only forested areas that are left are these two, which are both indigenous reserves. And this is why I took that picture that you saw. And this is a picture of the botanic parks in São Luís do Maranhão, installed by Vale, the company that originally created this entire aluminium industry. And the size of this botanic park, so a piece of Amazon that has been conserved for people to be able to go on their Sundays and visit, is 100 hectares. And 100 hectares is just a nice way to say 1 square kilometer, right? So it's less than a square mile. So if you compare this is like what they call social project or environmental compensation to this, and you don't need a lot of math to understand that there is much more destruction than there is conservation going on. And also the same kind of mechanism you see in their social communication. So here it says, since 43 years, we're proud to belong to this region, which is the mining site in a Quilombola, in a Maroon land, Afro-Amazonian community. And there's this picture of this lady. Well, I've been standing one morning at the quay in this mining town since 4 o'clock in the morning, because that's when my ship arrived. And I saw all the people coming in their ships too, all the workers. I saw many men, not many women. I saw not many black people, and I certainly didn't see many black women. Yet they took this picture to represent their social policy, right? So they, in a way, they even incorporate a black woman as being part of their social policy, whereas the jobs that they provide are for many people, but not necessarily black women. And even, of course, the visit that I've been able to make to these aluminum companies, in a way, also contribute to this kind of mechanism of using images to show social awareness. So here I'm asked during my visit to Hydro to plant a tree on a mined out land, and it says Simon Loloff researcher. So I become part of their communication strategy. So this is the afterlife of aluminium, as I said, the basins that are still toxic. And in Suriname, actually, the aluminium industry has left. So here is the super modern hospital that they built when they got there and said, oh, this is good for development. But if you go there today, it is abandoned. The hospital is no longer there. And it is now used as an art space, which is very, very cool, because I was able to take a lot of the images and a lot of the information I have about this community I obtained by visiting this place. But still, it's not a hospital that it was meant to be. So this mining town that has no longer a hospital today. So how long does this aluminium boom really last? And how long does it provide benefits to the community? What happens afterwards? At the same time, I am in a difficult dilemma, because there are certain things underway in the aluminium sector. For example, they are changing the production method. And that was the big item that was being discussed in Quebec last week, was how it's going to look like, because they're trying to now produce aluminium through a different process, no longer the wood process as we have known it, but a process that will no longer emit CO2. And who are the companies that are involved in this? It's Hydro, the Norwegians. It is Rio Tinto, so the Canadian, Australian, and Alcoa, the Americans. Right? So if we look at different aluminium industries in the world, at this Quebec conference, there was no representative of Rusal, the Russian company. There was no representative of the Chinese companies, even though there was a consultant there who afterwards, after my presentation, I learned who was actually representing a Chinese aluminium company, but didn't say so on his badge. But the companies that are willing to talk, the companies that are willing to engage in this process of trying to produce green aluminium are the ones that are in the Amazon. So the problem becomes that if we criticize them all the time, what could happen is that they will leave, but they will not destroy their facilities behind them, right? Because it's so much invested money. They may eventually leave Brazil or something, but what if Rusal would come in and take over, or a Chinese company, who are much more carbon intensive than, for example, Alcoa or Hydro. And also, as we have seen, for example, in Guyana, where the Chinese and Russian companies are active in bauxite mining, they are much less involved with social projects or that kind of things than Alcoa, Hydro, and Rio Tinto. This is the main dilemma that I see myself confronted with, that during the time I was in Belém talking to activists, I got this feeling of, okay, we have to stand up against these practices. But what is the alternative? That is really a problem. So we are on our way to create a method to do emission-free aluminium. But if you look at the companies that are doing this, Alcoa, Hydro is even low here, you cannot see it, and Rio Tinto, they're no longer the largest aluminium producers. So there is a kind of a split in the aluminium sector between some companies are trying to green aluminium production, and they're full of problems, as I have been talking about this for. There's a lot of problems, there are a lot of things that they have to cope with, including in their own history, which is often based on racism, as I've been able to show. But the alternative is even worse. That is a problem, right? That we are, what's coming in their place? We can see here what are the main aluminium companies today. And these are now companies that are famous for their social policies. Actually, if you can see how fast that has gone, like 3 years ago, this aluminium conference that I just attended is a yearly event of the aluminium sector. This year it was in Canada. 3 years ago, it was in Krasnoyarsk in Russia. So in 3 years' time, they went from being the host to being persona non grata, right? Of course, there were many other factors at play. But I would like to end with this dilemma because I don't really know how to deal with it, but I try to get closer to the aluminium sector as well, because that is how I do my work. That's how I can learn about the sector. And there is a main issue here with this divide between the relatively benign and the ones that are outright non-benign. So by that, I would like to end. Many thanks for your attention.
Simon, why don't you just take questions from here? We may have some questions in the chat.
Well, if you stop the screen share, people be able to see you a little bit better. The red stop share.
There we go. Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you for your presentation, Simon. I have a couple of questions. The first one is a very small one, just clarify something that maybe I didn't get. And the second one is a question regarding the last point you mentioned. The first question is related to is connected to this relationship between dams and the aluminium sector, because I know that dams in general, hydropower is an issue throughout the Amazon. And I was under the impression that it was an issue that kind of transcended individual industry because it is connected to, well, the idea of power as an enabler to a lot of activities and development, quote unquote, not only the aluminium sector. And even though you mentioned the connection between dams and aluminium in the case of Suriname, I wanted to ask you first to clarify, how do you make that connection that dams and aluminium are always kind of connected? I think you said that without the aluminium plant, you wouldn't have the dam in that particular case that you showed the map. So I wanted to ask you about the clarification between that connection that you make between those two. And the second one, moving forward to deal with this carbon-free aluminium process, does this process require a lot of new infrastructure? Because I'm assuming that most of these social environmental issues come from creating building new infrastructure. So I wanted to ask you if these carbon-free plants require just retrofitting the existing plants, or building new infrastructure from scratch, which could create more of these cycles of issues.
Sure. Shall I answer immediately, or yeah? So the first question about the relation between the dams and other sectors as well. That is a very fair point. We cannot just assume when there is a dam that it should be because of aluminium. However, in many cases, it was aluminium that provided the initial business case for the dam to be lucrative. So once you have the project for the dam, which is then provided by aluminium, because aluminium says, okay, we're going to buy the energy and we're going to invest in building this, or the country, actually, in the case of Brazil, Brazil was paid for the dam itself, particularly. But the expectation was that once they would have built the dam, then they would create so many jobs in the aluminium sector that would actually pay back for the costs of having built the dam. In the end, the dam was 5 times as expensive as they had foreseen. So it's questionable whether it actually recovered the money. But of course, once the dam is already being built, then you get other companies get involved too, and they say, well, if you're producing energy, then I would also want some, right? So then you get other other funding streams, but often it is the aluminium sector that provides the first. Without the aluminium sector, the whole entire process would not have started. That is very clear for some dams, but not all. For example, Belo Monte, it is still. I'm not decided whether I think it is really because of aluminium, or aluminium is a factor, or is it really the main factor? Yes or no. And there are also dams like Balbina, which are not related to aluminium. So it is not that straight of a story. Like dams in Amazonia are always because of aluminium. However, the biggest dams are. So there is Guri in Venezuela, there is Tucuruí in Brazil, and Belo Monte, I'm undecided. But these are very important projects. Whereas you cannot say that all dams are because of aluminium, aluminium is definitely an important factor in many of them. And the second question was about these carbon-free, so the thing is, in Quebec, when I was there is this entire mystery around the process, right? So the companies that are working on the process are not, as one of them said, told me oh, I was just biting my tongue because I cannot share too much of the process as yet because it is still being developed. So even the others in the room, other aluminium producing companies were like, oh, how much are you going to reveal? It was like a kind of whenever one of these companies would take the stage, it was like kind of a suspense, like, is he going to share any information that would give us a hint of how they're going to do it? So it is not very clear yet what it will be like. Probably they will start doing this in their home countries, so in Norway or in Canada. Whether it will be possible to do it also in Brazil afterwards, I don't know. It is really a very recent development, and not many people know about it even. It is really only in aluminium circles that is being discussed, and I don't know what anyone frequents aluminium circles. I wouldn't, but since I'm interested in Amazonia and I got interested in aluminium as a result of that, I am now also in that circle. But this is not yet on the front pages of newspapers. We don't know.
So just along the same lines, of course, these companies are in the process of patenting their technologies, so they're not going to share everything, but have they discussed at all the role of caustic soda going forward in this carbon-free futures?
No, that is not. So what the policy regarding caustic soda is basically containment. How we're going to deposit is in such a way that it doesn't cause harm. But I've not seen anyone discussing how you could refine bauxite into alumina without using caustic soda. Maybe in the future, but that was not a topic that was being discussed. And people, I think, have a short time frame in terms of we're depositing it. Sometimes it rains. We don't have an issue, therefore it is okay. But what if it does become an issue in the future? I think that that is not something that these companies often think about, that because these elements will remain in the soil, right? So what about hundreds of years? Sorry.
No, so it's sort of like a greenwash concept, because there's really all these other chemicals that are still going to be utilized that could potentially be contaminants.
Yes, at the same time, engineers are very focused, right? Because if you work in an aluminium smelter, so you do the whole Heerut process, that is an entirely different job from working in an alumina factory, right? So even for us, it is all part of the same supply chain, but for them, it's very different because they just deal with different technologies. So if the people who work on the carbon-free aluminium, they don't work on alumina themselves. They wouldn't even know how to make it. So I would have to talk to different people to find out. But there is a fair deal of greenwashing, as I've shown. Like, for example, these parks that are 1 square kilometer compared to the destruction. There is the picture of the black woman. Like, all these are examples of giving a very human face to something that is that is questionable in the best, right? However, for this emission-free aluminium, I believe that is really something that can be done. But as I said, it represents a minor fraction of the aluminium production market. And even as you just also reminded, like, it will not even be all of their plants, right? Because if it takes a lot of investment to change the plants, then maybe it will only be like a few places in the world that will be able to make it. But that's how the aluminium sector now sees the future. That is really the talk of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, great presentation. I had a question about, is there any local myth making when you go to the communities about aluminum at all? So are they trying to create ways of narrativizing this incursion in your space that kind of fits on longer timescapes or anything along that lines?
So you're looking like something like of these.
Well, because of the way that you framed your presentation, I thought it was interesting to think that maybe there's things that they're telling stories about alumina there that kind of illuminate, for lack of a better word, some of these sort of large industrial dynamics.
I've not come across any. No. I reminded me of that paper on the There Will Be Blood. I don't know whether you know it. Of the oil sector being like oil being presented as the blood of the earth, etc., and this being like a. But I would have, if I would have come across something like that, I would have certainly noted it down, but I didn't. So I cannot invent it.
One more question though. I was wondering if there was any connections with the guy. Like, did you get a chance to go to the Guyanese aluminum smelting areas, like the bauxite producing areas
in Guyana?
Yeah, like Linden and Coquitlam.
Yes, yes, you know it.
Huh?
You seem to know these places.
Yeah, I did. I was just wondering in comparison to those places because you said those were more Chinese run.
Yeah, so that means you have no access.
Zero access.
Zero access. You can send emails, they don't reply. It's impossible to you can of course go to the communities around the mining sites, and I've been, but yeah, you cannot get access to the company at all. They will not reply to any emails or anything. So that is very different. Yet it is only a fraction of the process. It's only the mining.
Right.
They used to do alumina there too, but they've stopped. It's an interesting history in Guyana because it was Alcan, the Canadian company, then it was nationalized. The idea like we have to do it ourselves, like our own industry, and all the revenue ends up here. It went wrong, and then they sold it to the Chinese and the Russians. So it is it's like a counter case or something. Like what if? But because the same thing could have happened in Brazil as well, right? So. But it is very difficult to get access to the company themselves, or what the workers say. There often are there's a lot of worker unrest and strikes, and even some of the mining operations have closed because workers were no longer willing to go in. So it is definitely a more tense environment for workers.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi, really nice presentation. I just was wondering if I was a little late, so you might have probably covered it, but just in case. Is there like what kind of relationship? Is there like pollution? And if so, how is this related? Because sometimes the extraction of oftentimes the extraction of resources obviously leads to pollution and a lot of diseases in local communities and stuff like that. And I was wondering especially how that interacts with mega dams, which usually create like these large pools of toxic stuff. And I was wondering if you have any of that.
So the pollution is mainly through the red mud, right? So it is not really air pollution, rather there's also some air pollution, but mostly soil pollution or the risk of pollution if it overflows. But of course, there's also the problem of these dams being so large that it was impossible because they were urgently built. They were needed like yesterday on such large tracts of land that there was no clearing of the forest beforehand, which is crazy in a country that is also doing logging, right? You have like a forest that's going to be flooded anyway, and you don't clear it before you build a dam, right? So it is a double deforestation. You continue logging somewhere else, and you flood the forest. So you have, that's why I had this picture of the trees standing, like the dead trees in the water. So this, of course, is an issue in the sense that these rotting material underneath the water level is emitting a lot of greenhouse gases. Exactly.
Which is even a lot, like I don't even remember how many times worse than CO2, right?
That's why I use the word greenhouse gases and not CO2, because exactly, yeah, methane is a exactly.
That's kind of where I'm going. Like, do you feel like the communities are how are they handling this? Is this, kind of what are they saying about this? And what are the companies saying? I know that with the Chinese, it's literally impossible, but I don't know if you have any.
So what did the companies say about this? A lot of this happened very far away in the past, right? So the companies are like, it was just a different time. It was a different, in some cases, it was even a different company because it was Vale,
Right.
and today it's Hydro. And in Suriname, like the dam is already, Alcoa has already left. So they do not say a lot about it. What do the communities say about it? A lot of these communities, some of them have moved to other, have found a way to survive still. Others have moved into gold mining, basically, especially in Suriname. And what happens today in Suriname is actually they're even doing gold mining in the bottom of the lake,
Right.
because there are these creeks that existed beforehand, and these creeks tend to accumulate a lot of gold from higher up in the mountains. So they're actually mining now the bed of the creeks within the lake. So that's really a crazy way of extraction. Plus, in Closer Lake, another gold containing area was identified in the 1990s, and many of these people find employment in this. So that's industrial gold mining. And then you have these situations of some people working in the mine, others not, and then they go in at night and still do mining in the same site, etc. So it's a crazy situation. You're familiar with it.
Do we have anybody in the chat? Oh, go ahead.
I was curious to know if you had any insight on why they chose dams to power the plants and maybe not like fossil fuels, and if there's maybe like talks about like replacing that with more like with like solar panels and just like, or like why dams? Like, or is it just because they were there and it's easy? Like, or...
The aluminium sector started with dams. Mm-hmm. It was the only way to do it in the beginning because they didn't have the batteries to store energy long enough to do it. So when it started in Pittsburgh, it was fueled by the Niagara Falls, and later by the Tennessee Valley Authority. So all the dams that were built in the American South were fueling the smelters in Pittsburgh, and then even the smelters were. Some of the aluminum sector actually built smelters and in the South as well, Tennessee.
And like coal plants couldn't produce power to. Like,
well, enough maybe, but not stable enough.
Oh,
because there was no batteries that could do it. And over time, it became, the Japanese were the first ones who did aluminium with fossil fuels. But actually, there was never a talk of replacing hydroelectricity with fossil fuels, because even the Japanese at that time thought it was a bad idea. It was just that they couldn't do hydroelectricity because of the earthquake problems. They did it first in Taiwan. When Taiwan was Japanese, before the war, they built an aluminium smelter there with an hydroelectric generation. But then they lost the war, obviously, so they lost Taiwan as well. And they tried to do aluminium in Japan, but they couldn't build the dams. And that is why they invested in Brazilian. So when Vale first built the aluminium industry in Pará, it was 51% Vale, 49% conglomerate of Japanese industries, including Mitsubishi. So there was never a talk of replacing hydro with fossil fuels, rather the opposite. Everyone wants a smelter with hydroelectricity, but not everyone can do it. And currently you even have like smelters in the Emirates and in Qatar. Oh, good luck with your hydroelectric dam over there. So, oh, solar power. There is talk about that in these places in Qatar. So there is the next aluminium industry conference will be in Dubai. So I guess we're gonna hear about that. How they're gonna do that, like solar? But that will be a novelty. Aluminium made out of solar. But it would be interesting if they could.
Super interesting talk. And I was wondering about corporate social responsibility or other development initiatives that maybe Chinese companies engage in. I'm thinking about C.K. Lee's book about multinational and Chinese companies in Africa. And she found that for copper mining, at least a strategic mineral, the Chinese state-owned company was more amenable to negotiations with the local government to provide developmental goods than multinational companies, because they just wanted to go wherever it was cheaper, and Chinese state-owned, not the privatized one, were like, we're gonna do this with you, we're gonna stick with you, and so they had a longer term strategic engagement. I wonder if you saw any sort of difference like that. That does the type of capital affect the way the aluminum company engages with local communities and local government?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know so much about copper or about the copper sector in Africa. The thing about aluminium is, though, that there is so much investment needed before you can even start producing, that this risk of going to different places is not as important. Once you start on the project, you start building, then you stick with what you started building, right? You're not easily shifting to some other place. Of course, well, you've seen like China is now half of the aluminium sector is Chinese. So they have well, a lot of the stuff that people use worldwide comes from China, right? So even if they emit more to produce the same thing, if we then end up buying those products from China, then we're also buying those emissions, right? So in the end, can we really produce enough aluminium with hydroelectricity, or do we really need fossil fuel powered aluminium in order to consume as we want and to do the energy transition? Is a question, right? I don't want to be like a China basher or something, because there is so much hypocrisy everywhere. But I don't think that answers your question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, did the Chinese do corporate social responsibility?
Not that I've seen, but maybe they would in the future.
Actually, Brian, I think that's a fascinating question, and I think it has to do with the same one. I'm sure you know, and I'm curious to see how you have seen it. I actually think that they do have a lot of programs with they might not fall under the umbrella of like social responsibility, but these longer term direct collaborations with local communities actually allow them not to, or kind of come to replace the accountability mechanisms that other transnational banks have, if that makes sense. So like a lot of the regulations that like they have to comply with certain regulations, they just negotiate with locally, which is interesting because then they get away with a lot of stuff. So it's hard for you to access. You can't even access their policies or their documents on like social responsibility, environmental assessments, nothing. I spent a good chunk of my life trying to do my best years. I'm trying to do that now like that. It's impossible, literally impossible. But I think they get away with that precisely with this kind of longer term, like in the communities where I work, they spend a lot of time, like for example, providing backpacks. Let's bring the notebooks for the kids. Do you need bed sheets? Sure. Let's give everyone like a set of bed sheets and stuff like that, you know, and so they mitigate a lot of things. Or like, let's pay this local community road. It's like nothing in terms of resources for them, but it actually allows them to get away with a lot of it. And I think the main difference is not having accountability.
Yeah, but that's also why you cannot really criticize easily, right? Because if you have like a company like Hydro, they do like all these projects, and then you can just, like I did, you can go and just laugh about it. It's like, look at this project, it makes no sense at all. But then what if a company doesn't have any project? Like, how are you going to make fun of that? But at the same time, there is all this hypocrisy involved, like a lot of the aluminium that there is no like market for green aluminium. And even if there is, it wouldn't really be green because it still comes from the Amazon, right? So that's also one thing that I try to question is like, okay, you can say like, oh, aluminium is green because it's hydro-based, but it is hydro-based in the Amazon. Actually, if you build a hydroelectric dam in China where you have these rivers that are basically in canyons, and you just do one dam after the other, you need much less land to be flooded for the same amount of electricity. Because Amazonia is so flat, if you do a dam there, you flood a lot of land. So there is hydro and hydro, right? There is like hydro that has a lot of emissions because it costs so much forest. And there's also hydro that it doesn't really cause all that many emissions. So there is a lot of different arguments to be made left and right, and I don't want to be conclusive and say that this is what it is, and this is what it's not. Yes.
So I wonder if your scope of work covers this, but like with all these, like with like US and EU and everything kind of going towards this like EV stuff, they're giving all these subsidies out. Like, how is like aluminum kind of being like treated that way? Is it are subsidies kind of going to companies of a certain nationality, or like is that something you would know of, or like?
I haven't really looked into that. I could. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, because I mean, it's the same thing with lithium that they're doing, like locally sourced lithium, but then like sometimes the lithium gets shipped away and then refined back and sent here. So, I don't know.
Well, there's a thing with lithium that you can actually find it in Sweden as well, right? There is lithium in Europe. However, with bauxite, since it is a commodity that specifically occurs everywhere, but it forms these massive bauxite deposits that you can easily mine under the influence of the weather. It needs to be hot and humid. So that's why you get it in Guinea, you get it in the Amazon, you get it in Australia, Northern Australia. So there is not much of it in Europe, but there is some. But since it started in Europe and in the US, there's also some in the US. But because the sector started there and started mining there, a lot of these deposits are already mined out. So you have to go to the global south, basically, or to Australia to get access.
And it's not like open pit mining, right? It's like
It is, yeah.
But is it as like environmentally you said it's kind of just like they're easily able to replace the soil, or like is it?
Yeah, they just remove what they want. The part of the soil that is high in alumina content, and whatever is left, they just put back, and then they plant a forest on top of it again. Like sometimes you have these reforestation programs, they keep the topsoil and put it the same soil back where it was before. So that's what this picture was from that you saw where I was planting a tree.
That was the form.
Yeah, that was the project. So it's fairly easy. Like the bauxite mining is not the polluting part, but the rest of it, they try to when you ask questions, they look at the mine. But they don't never say look at the dam.
Yeah.
They only say, oh, but all of our energy is hydro, but they never say how to produce the hydro.
Interesting.
Also, the hydro consumes a ton of concrete.
Well, there's also that factor. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the importance of really honing in on the aluminum industry, but I can't help but want to connect all of the production chain and effects to all of the other industries that feed into it, especially in terms of infrastructure, as you were showing, because they have to build the roads and the ports.
Exactly.
So that's virtually impossible to accurately estimate. So
I can only say that there is this impact, and then it stops because I cannot really go into then also doing research of the construction industry and the road construction business. But of course there is this, yeah.
but do you get a sense of like the relation or the magnitude of the relationships and if there are certain other processes or materials that are particularly correlated with certain parts of the aluminum chain?
Not as yet. Maybe in a future project, I would have to align with an economist and an engineer. But
So I have my question is actually a separate one. I was wondering if there's like a silver lining here, or what?
At the same time,
I'm like waiting for for there to be like some kind of a signal of hope that there might be.
If you turn around, the silver lining is the lining. These are all aluminum. So there you go. That's your silver lining.
oh, actually, there is I can tell you there is a piece of Australian alumina in this room, which was made out of Laotian from Laos, hydroelectricity, and made into aluminium in China. And I've seen several objects of this composition in this room. There's one there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we no, but the Apple computers.
Yeah.
No, but I don't know.
Because you said you had a moment of like where you were pointing out that we may want to rethink how we go, if we want to go to war with these companies that are in the Amazon, because it may be smarter to make them our friends and kind of work with them to help clean up the mess. And I thought that that was an interesting spin on what might be like something that's more tangible in terms of like what who's going to do something.
Well, that's the main open question: how to do that. That's why I went to this conference in Quebec. That's why I tried to be friends with some aluminium producers. And it's hard because I know much about them. But at the same time, what is the alternative? That is really the question. So is there a future for sustainable aluminium? I don't know. At the same time, we also need it for this energy transition. So unless we do massive degrowth, we have to be aligned with them at some point. But that is really the transformation that I've been going through over the past year since I've been talking to the companies directly rather than writing about them. Is how should I account for the fact that if I compare different production processes, that they are actually the front runners. And if you go to the Amazon and talk to people there, they have the opposite impression. So, like, how do we, as Elvis Presley says, how do we go on together with suspicious minds? Like, at the same time, we have to acknowledge that they're trying to improve, and what is the alternative? But people are very suspicious of them and very critical of them because of everything that happened. And I think that, well, one step would be to get them to understand a bit more of each other, maybe even for these companies to account for what has happened in the past, because they're not doing it yet.
And what are other people in this field? What kind of research are they doing for your like peers and colleagues that are studying aluminum in the Amazon or elsewhere?
I think
like
I think the only one who does it systematically am I. But some people do it on the country level. So I'm the only one who combines Suriname, Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil. But some people do it at the country level. But even then, I find it interesting. When I went to Belo Monte, like this dam, like it's a major thing, right? Everyone talks about Belo Monte in Brazil. So I visited them, and it was very easy to schedule a visit and to visit them. And I asked, like, how many people do you get here? I said, not many. So not many researchers actually go there in the first place. And I've been in discussions with Brazilian colleagues who said, like, oh, but you're privileged because you can go to these companies and visit them. Well, I don't know. Have you tried? No. So yeah, it could be. Maybe if they would try, being Brazilian, they would not be welcomed like I was. But I don't know because they haven't tried. But they don't want to try because they don't want to go. So there is this loop, and I don't know really whether I don't want to be like saying, oh, you haven't tried. Well, at the same time I do, but really there may or may not be this discrimination going on. But the fact is that Brazilian scholars, they do not often try to visit these companies because they prefer to write about them rather than. And yeah, I have this methodology, and I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it gives me other perspectives that other people do not get. I don't know. So people may think that I'm co-opted by the aluminium industry. Maybe not. I've given this talk. I did a lot of positive research.
You have the picture of you with the plan, so
Exactly.
you're done.
Yeah, done.
This kind of seems really similar to the situation that people run into when they do studies of like the soybean industry, for example, and they build contacts and relationships with major landowners. It seems like very similar to that situation. I wonder if that's the kind of situation that might be deeper. The people I know who have done that tend to be foreign researchers and not Brazilian researchers. I wonder if it's a similar type of dynamic happening.
There is, I think, a major difference is that these people probably have not befriended the most benign of soy producers, but they may, but I don't know. So they are befriending people who they disagree with in their work. Whereas I've come to the understanding that the people that I've befriended in the aluminium sector are actually the ones that you want to be friends with, if with anyone in the aluminium sector. And secondly, soy is not a necessary commodity for the energy transition or for any transition, as long as we give it to animals. If we want to eat it ourselves, it's okay. If we give it to animals, it's really unnecessary to have its production. So I think that there is that complicated relationship.
I think we should break for the moment here and end the webinar. And thank you again for the